Okay, here we'll be talking about an emergent American identity and kind of our ongoing study of contested or emerging identities more broadly across the scope of world history, particularly as it applies to the timeline of this course, the modern era. So, as English colonists began to concentrate their foothold in and along the eastern seaboard, basically the 13 colonies, they began to, over the decades and generations, begin to establish more distinct characteristics that differentiate with kind of characteristics that we had come to know before. Kind of ideas of Englishness begin to fall by the wayside, and a more of an American kind of experience begins to emerge. They began to adapt religious doctrine to fit the kind of more rough individualistic lifestyle of colonial life. This became known as what was called the Great Awakening during the early decades of the 18th century. There were several factors that influenced this. Immigration. You had an influx of various German, Scottish, Scotch Irish, that is to say, taking those in total, kind of non-English populations that are going to bring with them different and new brands of Protestantism, and that combined with a pioneering spirit that colonists began to embrace in America because out of a simple necessity, meant that it would help feed into this idea of the Great Awakening itself. In some cases, I think there's some scholars that would characterize this as a second Great Awakening. So you can think of it in those terms. This would also, in many respects, provide a greater sense of diversity among Protestant denominations, which is very characteristic of the Great Awakening. And it was a key element to the further developing of democratic principles in in the Americas itself. Along with this, there were also political aspects and distinctions that began to emerge. Not only was this the case as we move through the series of imperial wars dating back to the late 1680s and kind of the late 17th century, um, we'll focus most of our attention on the French and Indian War, the last, you might say, of the major imperial wars between European empires and their effects on the New World populations and settlements. And that occurred, ran from 1756 to 1763. So we're covering a pretty good amount of ground in this lecture, but we will move at a pretty good clip. So we hopefully should be through this in pretty good order. Uh, it has to be said and needs to be stressed that the colonies during this period of time, specifically the English colonies, were going through a tremendous change, specifically when we pivot into the 18th century. Between 1700 and 1760, the population of the English colonies grew sixfold, so that by 1750, there were over 1 million colonists in the 13 colonies. And beginning about the year 1708, Germans began to arrive in the English colonies in larger numbers. Dutch settlers were already established in places like New York and Delaware. We talked about that in earlier lectures. Um, you also have the influx of Swedes, as I said, Scotch Irish, Swiss, Welsh, Irish, Finns, French, and Jews all beginning to make their way to the English eastern seaboard. Again, the 13 colonies. Some colonists that were already here, such as Benjamin Franklin, argued that the American colonies, as they began to be kind of described, could endure the rapid population growth because of the abundance of land. That the land could accommodate the rising population and immigration. He saw the land as an opportunity for people to work for themselves, often in agriculture, as you might expect, which meant having large families in order to work the land. It also meant that labor would continue to be in demand. And this would provide, in Franklin's estimation, this would provide America with a distinct identity separate from England. And that's crucial to understanding, the um, dimensions and the developments taking place to establish and cultivate a sense of American identity. It also emphasized, in his estimation, a pioneering spirit as well. So here we're stressing things like individuality and self sufficiency. These new immigrants, these new colonists, brought their religions with them, again, most of which were Protestant. Reasons for coming to the American colonies were included escaping from, you know, discord, war, um, political intolerance, economic hardships. And since about 1683, European powers were in a near constant state of war up until the late 18th century. And so, with that kind of chaos, with that kind of instability, um, affecting the affairs of state of Europe and elsewhere around the kind of growing global empires of those European powers. Places like uh, the English colonies themselves kind of became a safe haven of sorts. And immigrants proved to be a valuable asset in strengthening the defense of the colonies themselves. Again, that could be susceptible to, their own, attacks, either from Native Americans or from neighboring hostile imperial um, neighbors. In the case of the French beginning to intrude on or contest English land claims or Spanish versus English or what have you. And it also, again, by attracting settlers, this legitimized European land claims in the New World. So, in the case of people coming to the English colonies, this meant that, with a larger number of people, that it became de facto that, in essence, the English colonies were, you know, um, uh, had a legitimate claim to the areas that they laid claim to because they had the population to, in essence, back it up. The more people, the greater advantage over rival colonies. And there were some others in addition to Benjamin Franklin that had ideas about all of this. One of which was a man by the name of Hector Saint John de Crevecoeur, a French immigrant to America, to the American English colonies. He noted how most of Europe's poor and middle class were the ones that came to the American colonies, while Europe's rich stayed or tended to stay in Europe. That many were driven by a need, a search for wealth, kind of giving a nod to economic necessity in order for people to make the hazardous, lengthy, uncomfortable trip to the 13 colonies. And I mean, that kind of plays out. I mean, it even holds true, you could argue today, that, if you are in a position of comfort or wealth, or if you're benefiting from the status quo as is, there's very little need for you to emigrate to a new area, a new part of the world. Usually, it's only those that are victims or are looking to better their lot in life or better their economic situation or provide a better way of life that are going to take the chance and run the risk of, you know, um, losing, one's life or, kind of uh, standard of living or health or what have you by making these kind of hazardous trips and immigrating to different areas. Um, so de Crèvecœur's ideas and kind of this underlying rationale being applied to why people move and move from one part of the world to another seems to hold up over the test of time. Of course, there was this helps contribute to the foundation of an early distinct American identity. Now we've already traced some of that all the way back to the first arrivals, the pilgrims among them. Um, but there would be now a successive wave of immigration taking place, which would mean that there would be interactions between the people, the Europeans that were here, and the Europeans that were arriving, and reactions to newcomers could result in things like trepidation. I mean, that most um, there were some that were anxious, fearful, resentful of the arrival of newcomers, but most, it seems, were welcoming. For his part, William Penn looked to establish a tolerant community where freedom of worship could be practiced. And he was fundamental in establishing the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This promise, this focus on creating a community or colony of tolerance, attracted Quakers who flocked to settle in the area, and many Germans as well. Also, we can see this in places like Western Maryland and Frederick and County, and also in and around Hagerstown as well. So, even from its earliest foundations, the American colonies, again under the British protection, still at this point, were arguably multicultural. And even though they were primarily and predominantly European, they were coming from all over Europe in many respects, or at least from the northern and eastern, northern and western portions of Europe during this period of time. There's also the effects of the Great Awakening that would be crucial to understanding and cultivating a sense of American identity. The awakening itself was predicated on five key characteristics, um, and they were centered on the idea of kind of a revivalist belief that new converts to Christianity, or new expressions of Christianity, would experience their conversion, that people would be imbued with the Holy Spirit, that good works wasn't enough. One had to feel God working within oneself. Oftentimes, this would lead to people becoming enraptured. That would have some sort of um, bodily experience. That manifests itself in either, you know. Um, almost like a seizure like effect, but this would be the Holy Spirit kind of working within the individual itself. Uh, the awakening and this kind of approach to religious faith and the expression of it um, was unique to and found kind of a natural uh, breeding ground within the colonies, the American colonies themselves. Again, American colonies, English colonies, they're really kind of synonymous. It just depends on how far you want to distinguish American identity, which is in the process of development during this period of time. Anti-revivalists, those that were much more reserved in their religious practices and religious expressions, saw this as self delusion and described it as enthusiasm, which was not the purpose, and church was not the place for that type of behavior. That this kind of turned religious worship into theater rather than to be kind of devout and reverent and solemn in religious devotion and kind of respect. This gets at the core uh, of what we know to be evangelicalism today. So, revivalists, for their part, were evangelicals. Anti revivalists were not. These are expressions of religious kind of, again, enthusiasm, as it was described. Um, Also, anti revivalists would point to expressions of uh, this kind of theatric behavior as being false and leading congregations astray when it came to practicing the faith. There would also be a social aspect to this. Revivalists were more often than not coming from the poorer segments of colonial society. Anti-revivalists were mostly wealthier individuals. That goes to figure. I mean, the wealthy wanted to maintain the status quo. The poor, more agitating, more willing to engage in change. They were more impassioned, impulsive, you might say. There was also within the awakening movement, the Great Awakening, a millennialist type of mindset. This adheres to the biblical belief in the biblical timeline that Christ would return to enact Judgment Day, and they had to, in the eyes of evangelicals, you had to prove your faith beforehand in order to ensure salvation. And in many cases, these people would come together from kind of a broad swath of the surrounding countryside, with all across within the colonies themselves, uh, and meet at what became known as revivals. These were key to keeping pace with westward expansion. So ministers, the priests, you might say, became more mobile. That people couldn't make it to church, and so these people went to where the people were on the frontier or out in these remote communities, um, to bring religion to them where they were, in essence. Um, and this was a movement. This was the aspects of the Great Awakening here, the whole kind of list of characteristics. These would last some 200 years or so. I mean, you can see characteristics of this type of behavior, this type of practice, even today within the evangelical movement to a large degree. In the Great Awakening, lasting from about 1720 to 1740, as a most vivid expression, um, saw the formation of new Protestant groups, such as the Baptists and Methodists, and their churches. Um, and interestingly, this begins to hit, in many cases, enlightened ideas of reason with more emotional appeals, as was characterized in the evangelical faith. And again, we get at this duality, you might say, within the American identity between reason, the application of kind of, um, you know, really premeditated thought and kind of a rationale, a very methodical approach to um, not only problem solving but also to engaging in and pursuing one's interests in daily life, to more emotional, impulsive, reactionary types of approaches or ways of life here as well. Those live side by side during the Great Awakening, but those live side by side for so much of American history. Even before it becomes the America becomes an independent kind of entity in itself. but in many cases, it's reflective of the needs and the experiences again of the colonists. And that there was a true uh, that kind of religious zeal found a natural kind of receptive audience in the colonies themselves. To round out this lecture, we'll turn attention towards now the um, kind of political and military dimensions, key turning points when it came to strategic interests. And the best example of this comes as a result and the fallout emerging from the French and Indian War. I think we can get through this in this one segment. So, in essence, the French and Indian War, again from 1756 to 1763, was pit the British against the French. Um, the main dispute was with regard to overlapping land claims in the Ohio Valley. France, for its part, begins to build a stronghold near today what is known as Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They build a fort called Fort Duquesne there in order to establish themselves. French, or excuse me, British colonial forces were defeated in their attempt to overrun that fort. That detachment was led by a young major by the name of George Washington. In 1755, though, the British are going to really kind of gear up for more of a formalized invasion. And that occurs, like I said, 1755, when General Edward Braddock led a second expedition to conquer Fort Duquesne, which met with disaster. Two-thirds of his force were killed or wounded by a small French and Indian force that had resorted to using guerrilla tactics in the dense wilderness that lay between the colonial frontier and Fort Duquesne itself. Again, the French and the Native Americans, by and large, are allied with one another against the British. That event and news of its spread are really going to help expand this conflict between the French and the British into a war. World war. Um, the Britain decided to conquer Canada once and for all, basically saying, "Look, we're going to kick the French out. We're going to just decide this matter once and for all." Wartime policies really emphasized the growing disagreement and discontent between the British and the British colonists in the Americas. First and foremost, among these wartime policies that kind of emphasize this stress, this tension, centered around notions of recruitment. Recruited colonists into the regular were recruited into the regular army, um, or they wanted them to be. They British themselves expected enthusiastic colonial support, but very quickly they realized that they were going to have to coerce colonists into service. And so they began to impress colonists into the service of the British military itself, basically forcing them into service. Um, they inducted indentured servants without compensating their masters into service. Um, and as a result, by 1757, recruitment falls. That they had lost the support and the willingness of the colonists themselves. In this case, in that case, it placed greater pressure on Britain having to take troops from Britain and elsewhere in the British Empire and move them over to the Americas on ferrying troops across the Atlantic or elsewhere from the Caribbean and the like. When you do that, the costs of the war go up because now the logistics is becoming more and more of a drain on money. To keep costs down, the British decided that they would quarter the British troops not in barracks on kind of within forts that all have to be built from scratch, but instead they would be quartered, they would be housed in the private homes of American colonists themselves without the owner's permission in many cases. And this would include basically outbuildings, farms, other kinds of facilities, or farmhouses or what have you. British troops also took whatever they needed, again, without necessarily compensating the colonists. So this is a very expensive type of policy um, for the colonists in the American colonies. Also, the chain of command was rather humiliating. The highest ranking colonial officer was subordinate to the lowest ranking British officer. Um, and as the war moved along, British troops took credit for victories and blamed any types of defeat on the colonial militia themselves. So there was bad blood here between the British forces themselves and the colonists and any contribution that the colonists themselves offered up. Because of these types of policies, the colonists themselves began to engage in an illegal trade with French forces. That there was a very active black market that began to emerge. Anytime there's warfare, especially during this period of time, in pre-modern warfare, um, goods become scarce. And when that happens, people begin to buy and sell scarce commodities in a black market that would fetch hefty, generous prices for the exchange of goods. And economics doesn't really discriminate when it comes to national loyalties. So in many cases, you had um, the colonists, American colonists in the British colonies themselves engaging in trade with the French, the enemy of the British themselves. And this, in many cases, prolonged the war effort. Um, and any effort on the part of the British to confiscate goods would only go to alienate the colonial support from the very people that they were there to kind of oversee, protect, and so on. So this became a very vicious cycle here. Prime Minister William Pitt um, committed the bulk of Britain's forces to the war in North America in order to guarantee victory. And by 1759, the British had succeeded in blockading the French, which meant that the French colonies in the Americas, along the St. Lawrence Seaway in Canada and also in the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi Valley, were essentially cut off from any resupply, um, specifically resupply of troops. And so as a result, that really spelled the doom for French interests in the North American continent. And this would lead to the Treaty of Paris, which was signed on February 10th of 1763, in which France relinquished control of virtually all claims, territorial claims in North America. It was also successful in alienating British colonists further because it was so terribly expensive. The British government began to support raising taxes on colonists in order to pay for those wartime expenses. But again, this further angered an already fuming population that had been upset during the war, now had reason to remain upset even after the war was over. The British believed that the colonists owed the motherland for protecting their interests, and many colonists felt no such loyalty. New policies, post war policies like that of the Proclamation Line of 1763, curtailed any movement of colonists westward over the Appalachian chain. Um, and so as a result, the colonists here are feeling like they've completely gotten the short end of the stick, that they are, in essence, um, you know, this war was not fought for their interest because now they're cut off from any further westward migration. They are now having to pay for the war themselves through larger taxes. And so, in many respects, they weren't. It's kind of like, well, what did we get out of this? So, this is going to lead to this